Shadow Kaydee welcomed the sunrise together, and it felt like a new beginning. Before the sun appeared over Big Bear, the mountains were still wrapped in blue-gray darkness. The lake below was quiet. The pine trees stood almost motionless against the horizon, and somewhere high above the valley, two familiar silhouettes were already awake. Shadow and Kaydee, they were not fighting over the nest. They were not chasing an intruder. They were not separated by miles of wilderness. They were simply there, together. And then, as the first light began to reach the mountains, their voices broke the silence. Soft chortles carried through the morning air. One eagle called. The other was nearby. And for people who have been watching Shadow and Kaydee slowly learn one another over the past several weeks, there was something unusually peaceful about the scene. No dramatic confrontation, no awkward attempt to get closer. No moment where Shadow seemed to say, "That's close enough." Just two bald eagles beginning another day in the same place at almost the same time, under the same sunrise. It was simple, but perhaps that is exactly why it felt so important. Because sometimes a new chapter does not begin with something dramatic. Sometimes it begins quietly. Two birds, one valley, one sunrise, and the growing possibility that neither one is quite as alone as they were before. Kaydee's arrival in Big Bear has rarely been quiet in the minds of the people watching her. From almost the beginning, every appearance created questions. Why does she keep coming back? Why does she follow Shadow? Why does she keep visiting the nest? Why does she seem increasingly comfortable in places Shadow has used for years? And most importantly, what does Shadow think about all of this? At first, the answers were impossible to read. Kaydee was new. Shadow was established. Every interaction seemed uncertain. Sometimes Kaydee approached, sometimes Shadow moved away. Sometimes she followed him almost immediately after he took off. Sometimes they perched near one another for long periods. At the nest, Kaydee began exploring. Then she began moving sticks. Then one day, Shadow returned and joined her around the nest material. Another time, Kaydee moved so close to Shadow's face that viewers described the beak-to-beak interaction as a tiny eagle kiss. Shadow did not exactly turn it into a romantic movie scene. He created some space. But even after those moments of hesitation, the two eagles kept appearing together again. That pattern has become impossible not to notice. Kaydee approaches. Shadow reacts. They separate, then somehow another meeting happens, and another and another. Now we have something slightly different. Not simply Kaydee chasing after Shadow. Not simply Kaydee trying to get closer. This time, the camera caught them inside one of the most peaceful moments Big Bear can offer. The beginning of a new day. There is something special about watching bald eagles at sunrise. Before the valley becomes bright and active, there is a period when everything seems suspended. The air is cooler, the shadows are long, the sky slowly changes from deep blue to pink, orange, and gold. For an eagle, dawn is practical. A new day means opportunities to move, hunt, inspect territory, and respond to everything happening around them. But for the people watching from thousands of screens, sunrise carries another meaning, beginning, and it is almost impossible not to feel that symbolism when Shadow and Kaydee are there at the same time, especially now. Because their relationship, whatever it ultimately becomes, is still at the beginning, too. They do not have years of history together. They do not have a long record of breeding seasons. We cannot look at them and say exactly what the future will be. Instead, we are watching the tiny moments that may eventually become that history. A shared tree, a call, a flight, a nest visit, a stick moved together, a beak touching another beak, and now a sunrise. Their vocalizations make the moment even more interesting. Bald eagles communicate with a variety of calls, and vocal behavior does not automatically mean romance. A call may relate to awareness, territory, excitement, contact, or simply the presence of another bird. So hearing Shadow and Kaydee vocalize around the same morning does not prove that some dramatic pair bond suddenly formed overnight. But that is not really the most important part. The important part is familiarity. They know the other eagle is there. Their lives are beginning to overlap, often enough that communication has become part of the pattern. Kaydee is no longer simply an unidentified bird appearing somewhere on the edge of Shadow's territory. She is a bird he has encountered repeatedly, and Shadow is clearly no longer just another distant adult eagle in Kaydee's travels. She watches where he goes. She has followed him. She has joined him around familiar perches. She returns to the nest he uses. Their worlds keep crossing, so when their calls enter the same quiet morning, the sound means something even if we cannot translate it. It means another encounter is happening, another moment of recognition, another opportunity for these two eagles to decide how much space they are willing to share. And perhaps that is why this sunrise felt different from some of their more dramatic interactions. Kaydee did not need to force the moment. She did not have to fly directly towards Shadow. She did not have to test his personal space. She did not have to nibble his feathers or reach for his beak. She simply existed beside him in the same morning. That may sound like less, but in a developing relationship, sometimes calm can mean more than excitement. Early encounters between wild animals can be full of uncertainty. Every movement matters. Every approach can trigger a response. But as familiarity grows, something changes. The need for constant reaction can begin to disappear. Two individuals can simply remain nearby. They can do nothing spectacular, and that lack of drama becomes interesting in itself. Maybe that is one of the things we should watch most carefully with Shadow and Kaydee. Not only how often they interact, but how comfortable they become when they do not need to interact at all. Can they sit in the same area peacefully? Can one move without the other reacting strongly? Can they share the first quiet minutes of a morning? Those questions may eventually tell us more than one photograph that looks like a kiss. Kaydee has often been the more obvious character in this developing story. She is curious. She explores. She returns. She moves towards Shadow. She follows after him. She investigates the nest. And when a stubborn stick refuses to move, she seems willing to wrestle with it until either the stick or Kaydee wins. That persistence has made her incredibly easy to watch. But lately, Shadow's role may be becoming just as important, because instead of asking only, what is Kaydee doing, we can begin asking, what is Shadow allowing to continue? He has had many opportunities to turn every interaction into a permanent separation. Yet the encounters continue. He moves away. Then there is another meeting. He leaves the nest. Then he returns. Kaydee remains somewhere in the territory. Shadow appears again. That does not mean he has already chosen her as a mate, but it means their story has not ended. And this sunrise is another example. Shadow could begin his morning alone somewhere else. Kaydee could begin hers somewhere else. Instead, once again, there they are. Inside the same landscape. Inside the same morning. There is an almost human tenderness to the idea. You wake up. The world is still quiet. The person, or in this case, eagle you have been slowly getting to know, is nearby. Nothing has to happen. No grand gesture. No dramatic declaration. Just presence. We should never confuse that emotional interpretation with scientific certainty. Shadow and Kaydee are bald eagles. Not characters in a romance written for us. But perhaps that is why people connect with them so deeply. Their behavior gives us just enough familiarity to recognize something from our own lives. Relationships do not always grow through dramatic moments. Sometimes they grow through repetition. Seeing someone again, being comfortable enough to stay, sharing ordinary time, returning tomorrow. And maybe that is the emotional heart of what is happening in Big Bear. Kaydee keeps returning. Shadow keeps being there. And gradually, the extraordinary part is becoming how ordinary their presence together can look. For many viewers, that ordinary feeling is exactly what they have been hoping to see. The Big Bear nest has carried enormous emotion, loss, memory, uncertainty. People have wondered what would happen next, whether Shadow would remain, whether another eagle would enter the picture. Whether the familiar rhythm of two adult eagles moving through this territory might ever return, Kaydee cannot erase what came before, and she does not need to. She does not have to become another version of anyone. Her story with Shadow can be completely different, perhaps even slower, more awkward, more playful, more uncertain. What matters is that it belongs to them. And seeing Shadow and Kaydee greeting a new morning together gives that possibility a visual form. The sun rises whether or not we are ready. Nature moves forward, and sometimes, quietly, the characters we are watching begin moving forward too. There is still plenty we do not know that needs to remain at the center of this story. We do not know whether Shadow and Kaydee will eventually become a breeding pair. We do not know whether Kaydee will remain in Big Bear permanently. We do not know whether her interest in the nest will continue as the seasons change, and we should be careful not to turn every shared perch or call into evidence of courtship. But uncertainty does not make these moments meaningless. It simply changes what they mean. Right now, perhaps the best word is not love. Maybe it is possibility. The possibility that familiarity is growing. The possibility that Shadow is becoming increasingly comfortable with Kaydee's presence. The possibility that Kaydee is beginning to treat Big Bear as more than a place she occasionally visits. And perhaps the possibility that these quiet mornings will become more common. That is enough, more than enough, because a future does not appear all at once. It arrives as small signals. A few seconds after Shadow flies, Kaydee follows. A few days later, she is back at the nest. Shadow leaves. Kaydee stays and continues working. Then Shadow returns, they interact around the same sticks. Kaydee moves closer. Shadow sets a boundary, but the next meeting still happens. Then comes another morning, and their voices are in the valley together. When you line those moments up, something begins to emerge, not proof, a pattern. And patterns are where wildlife stories become interesting. It is one thing for two eagles to cross paths once. It is another for their movements to begin intersecting again and again across days. Nest, perch, flight, call, return, sunrise. Each is another point on the map, and slowly, the map begins to look like two lives becoming less separate. That may be the new signal worth watching. Not a kiss, not even nest work. Routine. Routine is quiet. It does not create spectacular thumbnails. But in nature, routine can be powerful. Who do you regularly share space with? Whose calls do you hear every morning? Whose movements affect where you go next? Which nest do you return to? Which territory begins to feel familiar? If Shadow and Kaydee begin creating routines around one another, that could be far more revealing than one dramatic encounter. Because routines mean consistency. And consistency is what separates a moment from a relationship. We may still be too early to say that is happening. But morning scenes like this give us a reason to watch for it. What happens tomorrow? Will both eagles be nearby again? Will their calls overlap again? Will Kaydee follow Shadow after they leave? Will one go to the nest while the other remains on a nearby perch? Will they reunite later? Every ordinary day now has the potential to add another answer. And perhaps that is why this particular sunrise feels so hopeful. Hope does not require certainty. In fact, hope exists because certainty is missing. We do not know what comes next. That is the entire point. We look at two eagles beneath a changing sky and imagine possibility. Maybe months from now, this sunrise will mean nothing more than two birds sharing the same area on one peaceful morning. That would still be beautiful. Or maybe someday we will look back and realize something was beginning to change during these quiet days. Before anything was obvious, before any clear partnership, before the answers. There were simply mornings like this, Shadow Kaydee, close enough to hear each other, familiar enough to remain, watching the same light arrive over Big Bear. There is another detail I love about sunrise. For a few minutes, the light changes everything it touches. The dark branches become gold. The lake begins reflecting the sky. Feathers that looked gray moments earlier suddenly show every small detail. There's nothing actually changed. The world was already there. The light simply made it easier to see. Maybe that is what is happening with Shadow and Kaydee. Perhaps there is no single moment when their relationship suddenly becomes something new. Maybe we are simply beginning to see the pattern more clearly. Kaydee S returns. Shadow S responses, their shared locations, their nest interactions, their flights, their calls. One by one, the light is reaching those moments and the picture is becoming easier to see. Not complete, but clearer. For now, Shadow still seems like the more cautious one. Kaydee still seems willing to close the distance. That contrast probably will not disappear overnight, and maybe it should not. There is something endearing about watching two very different behavioral styles meet. Kaydee seems to say, "I am here again." Shadow seems to answer, "Yes, I noticed." Kaydee moves a little closer. Shadow decides whether that is acceptable. Then eventually, they both move on, but lately, the important part is this: they keep reaching another morning, another meeting, another chance. And every new encounter gives Shadow the opportunity to behave differently. One day, perhaps the biggest clue will not come from Kaydee at all. It will come from him. Maybe Shadow will be the one who follows. Maybe Shadow will approach first. Maybe he will arrive at the nest where Kaydee is already working and immediately join her. Maybe one morning the distance between their perches will simply be smaller. Nothing dramatic, but different. And everyone watching will notice. That is the future worth waiting for. Not because we need a fairy tale ending, but because the process itself is beautiful. Wild relationships develop on the animal's schedule, not ours. They can take weeks, months. They can change direction. An individual can leave. Another can appear. Nothing is guaranteed, but that uncertainty allows us to appreciate each small step honestly. Today, we have a sunrise. There's two eagles, their voices, their repeated presence, and another peaceful morning in which Shadow and Kaydee were part of the same scene. Tomorrow may bring something entirely different. There's maybe more nest work, maybe another flight together, maybe Kaydee will follow Shadow across the valley again. Maybe Shadow will surprise everyone and choose to stay closer. Or maybe nothing remarkable happens at all. And even that could matter. Because two eagles simply being comfortable enough to share ordinary time may itself become a clue. The sun is higher now. The magical colors of dawn will fade into normal daylight. Shadow will have places to go. Kaydee will make her own choices. They may separate, they probably will at some point, but separation no longer feels like the end of the story. We have seen too many returns. That may be the most hopeful thing about these two. Not that they remain together every second, but that somehow they keep finding another moment. Another tree, another nest visit, another flight, another sunrise, and maybe someday, without any dramatic announcement, those moments will become a life pattern. For now, we should resist the temptation to name it too soon. Let Shadow be Shadow. Let Kaydee be Kaydee. Let nature decide what comes next. But we can still smile at what we are seeing, because this morning felt peaceful. It felt gentle. And perhaps after everything Big Bear has experienced, gentle is exactly what this story needs. A sunrise instead of a storm. A quiet call instead of a confrontation. Two eagles instead of one lonely silhouette. And a future that is still unwritten. So when the next Big Bear sunrise appears, watch carefully. Listen before the valley becomes fully awake. Look at the familiar branches. Look toward the nest. Look toward the places Shadow likes to perch. And then look for Kaydee, if she is there again, if their calls meet again in that morning air, if they begin another day inside the same landscape. Maybe we are watching something very simple become something very important. Not a declaration, not yet a pair, just a new rhythm. Shadow, Kaydee, morning after morning. And perhaps somewhere inside that rhythm is the first real signal of what might come next. Because every new chapter needs a first page. And sometimes, the first page is nothing more than two eagles welcoming the sunrise together.